Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and on this podcast, me and my co hosts break down some TV show we happen to be watching, sometimes movies, sometimes other content, but usually just week to week following a popular television show, something you can watch along with us and provide some context and some humor and some analysis along the way. And of course, we're discussing The White Lotus, the very popular HBO Max series. Episode 7, just 1 week away from the finale. This episode is called Killer Instincts. I'm joined once again by my co host, Sona.
Hi.
And to kick things off, I had a few observations from last week's episode, but most importantly, wanted to mention the fact that, of course, we just saw a terrible earthquake out in
Yes.
Thailand this weekend. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people are dead from that. And just a reminder of part of the reason this show is set here, this incredibly beautiful but somewhat dangerous area of the world. And it made me think about watching the Shogun series, Sona, which if you haven't caught up with it, recommend it very highly. And they are making a second season of that after its record setting and winning all those Emmys. But there's a really interesting episode where the star of the show, this British pirate who ends up in this Edo era Japan, talks about how the houses are made out of paper and they're so transigent, they're so like not sturdy. And then an earthquake hits and everything gets destroyed. And he goes, "Look how everything was destroyed." And his love interest in the series explains to him that things are built that way because there's this understanding that death is part of life and that nature can destroy what you build. So, yes, these houses are not that sturdy, but they're also very easy to rebuild. And I just thought about that in the context of course, this very earthquake prone part of Asia. And thematically, that actually ties into this show and to this episode as well. The idea that death and violence is part of life. And very contradictory to, we're seeing a little bit of a push and pull here thematically between this Buddhist philosophy of peace, always peace, never violence, as opposed to this cosmological, traditionally Chinese belief of yin and yang, the idea that the dark and the light are in a continuous cycle. And as a matter of fact, that one emerges from the other. These aren't like diametrically opposed forces. They are actually in a continuum, that one thing becomes the other. And that also, I think, is something that thematically starts to play out significantly here in this episode. But I was just thinking about this in all the context of seeing this destruction out there. And of course, our hearts go out to anybody who is affected by this. We will hope for the best, and hopefully the cleanup and the casualties won't be that severe. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. That was a lot.
It was a lot. No, I mean, it's an awful tragedy, and we are thinking of the people there and all they're going through. Yeah, it is an unusual coincidence that,
Yeah.
we're discussing this show set in this part of the world at the same time this tragedy is happening.
On a much lighter note, here on the podcast, we are going to start discussing Mobland. If anybody's interested in that, this is a Paramount Plus series, directed the first couple of episodes at least, directed by Guy Ritchie, starring Tom Hardy, Pierce Brosnan, who was excellent in Black Bag. I've seen the first episode here, by the way. Not as impressed with his performance here in this show as I was. He was so good in Black Bag, that Steven Soderbergh movie that just is still in theaters right now. And Helen Mirren also here playing a very like Lady Macbeth-like character, maybe the most intriguing aspect of this show. But I did want to shout it out because it is available to anybody, whether you have Paramount Plus or not. The first episode's available for free, so check it out. I am on the fence with this one, I have to say, but we will be discussing it in much greater detail going forward throughout the season, and specifically this upcoming week. Another thing we discussed recently, Sona, did you watch the new Seth Rogen comedy, I guess, high concept comedy, The Studio, this week? Did you sample it at all?
You had mentioned it when we talked. I'm not sure if it was last time or the time before that. And I heard you. I didn't really have my interest piqued by our conversation, although I am fond of Seth Rogen. And then actually, over the last week, they had the cast of the show on
Mm-hmm.
The View, that
Yeah.
daily talk show. And the cast was really appealing and charming. So I might look into it.
it definitely is very inside Hollywood. So if you know these kind of silly stories, kind of ridiculous, almost accidental way that these people make these movies somehow against all odds, apparently. It is very entertaining, but I think even as a casual viewer, you'll enjoy it. You have incredible cameos. For example, they have IP that they're trying to make like the next Barbie, and they have terrible ideas. They want to make a Jenga movie, like stuff that they can actually get access to. And they decide that the IP that they're going to pursue to be the next billion-dollar franchise is the Kool-Aid movie.
Oh boy.
And everybody goes, "Oh yeah," when they hear about this idea. Eventually, he meets with Martin Scorsese. He is very high-minded, so he thinks that he's going to make great art, even though he's being pigeonholed into making this Kool-Aid movie. And he hears Martin Scorsese wants to make a movie about the Jonestown Massacre, and he goes, "That could be my Kool-Aid movie."
Oh my gosh.
The worst brand management for Kool-Aid. And
Oh,
it all falls apart by the end. And he makes the pragmatic choice that ends up throwing Scorsese under the bus. But it is very, very funny. But I would recommend everybody check out episode 2. They're talking about how hard it is to do a oneer. A oneer is like when you do a very long 10 or 15-minute shot continuously.
mhm.
This episode is 29 minutes long. It's about a director trying to shoot a oneer, and Seth Rogen micromanaging ends up completely sabotaging the oneer. But the entire episode, Sona, 28 minutes long, is a oneer. It's an incredible technical achievement. And Rogan does huge pratfalls, like smashes through furniture and stuff,
Mhm.
all in a continuous take. It's incredible. If nothing else, just check out episode 2. You don't have to watch anything else. It's all like self-contained. 2 episodes in, I find it very entertaining. A recommendation for me on that one. What an incredible cast, by the way. Such talented and funny people. And great cameos. Incredible. Everybody in it is incredibly.
Yeah, from what they showed on The View, the cast seemed to have a really fun chemistry together. So that's kind of what drew my interest.
And we were big fans, at least I was. I think we both were, of Platonic. And I
Love
thought
it. Yeah.
he's funny, but it's more about the chemistry he is able to create with his cast members and among the cast. So just a shout out to anybody who hasn't seen Platonic, which is available on Apple TV Plus. Very funny as well. And a couple more things before we get into the episode breakdown related to The White Lotus. My wife always is behind, even on Sunday nights. If she can watch the first few minutes with me, she doesn't finish watching the episode for days, usually. And I end up rewatching big chunks of the show because I walk into the room and she has it on, and I'll be on my phone, but I'll rewatch parts of the show. And I have to tell you, I have enjoyed the rewatch. I think maybe because I have so many expectations as I'm watching this show and was such a huge fan of season 2, as I've kind of outlined previously in this podcast. Aspects of it maybe didn't move as quickly as I wanted to. It wasn't the show I was expecting to see. So sometimes when I just watch scenes while my wife is rewatching, I end up enjoying it more because I can kind of just appreciate the conversation or whatever happens to be happening in the moment. And I have to say that in this rewatch this week, I walked in when the 3 ladies, the 3 blondes, are talking to each other. And I enjoyed the scene so much more, maybe because I wasn't thinking about how it fits into the context of the whole show, or, maybe I wasn't analyzing it. I was just kind of appreciating the dynamics and the performance. I really enjoyed it even more so. And I don't even know why. There wasn't like an incredible jaw-dropping scene, but I just liked how natural they felt in sliding into these old, probably decades old relationships. I just want to shout out that maybe a rewatch of this show for everybody out there is beneficial.
Well, one thing that actually I was thinking about regarding last week's episode in particular, but also I think generally this season, I feel like there's a lot more ambiguity than I'm used to from this show. I think there are always some characters where there's some ambiguity, because I actually was thinking about it in context with when we talked last week. I was kind of unhappy with my part of the discussion. I was kind of thinking like, gosh, I just didn't know where to land on a lot of this stuff. And then I was thinking about that when I watched this week's episode. And I felt like, maybe in my own defense, some of it is purposeful.
Absolutely.
That, there is a lot of ambiguity built into these characters, which again, I think is not unusual. but I think the scale of the ambiguity, as far as
Mhm.
like how many characters we're not sure about and the extent of the things we're not sure about, seems greater this year. So I could see on a rewatch maybe being able to either appreciate that ambiguity more or actually being able to form an opinion one way or the other on a rewatch about what you think is actually happening. Because I think that is something, I don't know, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. I think it's something I'm struggling with, and I think purposeful, of not knowing what people are really thinking and what their real motivations are and all of that type of stuff.
Yeah, I forget who it was from the cast who was talking about it. Either in one of it wasn't in this week's featurette, that extra scene at the end where they interviewed some cast members. It definitely wasn't in that section. But at some point, somebody, it might have been Carrie Coon, talking about how everybody is correct on the show and everybody is incorrect on the show. Like there's really nobody who is always the moral uh, guide, like the correct person, which I think we are usually used to. There's usually there's a character that is your not necessarily your audience surrogate, but almost like your um, moral guide through the story. And I think that Mike White, in general, in all of his projects, and specifically here, not always giving you that easy answer, is saying that this person is right in this particular context, but they're also kind of bad people, or this person is right in this context or not. And I think that that is very much represented among the three blondes, which is part of
Yeah.
maybe why I appreciated rewatching that scene so much. We touched on it briefly last week, but it's the idea that every one of them is making a valid point, but you really don't root for any one of them in that argument at the same time. They all are not really being constructive, and that is very much so exemplified in this week's episode, I think.
I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's a different point than what I'm struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
The moral right and wrong, I feel like that's always been a thing with
Yeah.
White Lotus and the gray areas of that. But for me, it's I'm not able to put my finger on the motivations of so
Oh, good
many of
point.
the
Yes. Mm-hmm.
characters.
Yeah.
Like Chloe, I don't
Mm-hmm.
quite have a grasp. Chelsea and Rick, I think I know, but I'm not entirely sure. Lachlan, I have no clue.
Yes, Lachlan's. We
Piper,
got to talk about Lachlan
yeah,
here because he is the one that I think of all the characters that you're describing. Like for me, Chloe, I don't understand, and I think that is interesting that they've revealed her to be more into this relationship than we at first suspected, and that has become a motif of these younger women. There's another scene here that kind of relates to that as well. That you assume, oh, they're just in it for the money, and it's like, well, maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong about that yet again. So that is interesting, but I think we can save it for the breakdown because Lachlan was very interesting to me because I think I interpreted Lachlan a certain way, and now
yeah.
I'm like, is he just a people pleaser that just does whatever anyone around him seems to? He just tries to reflect back at them what they expect him to do, and then he becomes like this like non-person at that point.
No,
and I definitely not how I read him earlier.
I agree, but I'm not even done with my list.
Oh, go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
Piper, I'm confused as
Oh
well.
my God, so confused
Mook,
by her.
I'm also confused. Like it
Yes. Mm-hmm.
just,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't feel like I've ever had so many characters where I'm unclear on what their real motivation and situation is. I'm used to it from a few characters,
Yeah.
but here I feel like at least a good 50% of the characters, I am not 100% certain that I know where they're coming from, whether I agree with them morally or not.
Well, some of them I have to say that in like the example of Lachlan, I think that it is showing us a character that probably isn't defined, making us interpret him a certain way, and then confounding that a little bit. And obviously, they've definitely done that with like Rick and Chelsea, how they have surprised us over and over again. And I think that is by the design of the show. However, I have to say that especially with the Mook character, for example, I just think that's an underwritten character. And with
Maybe.
Piper is, I think, the most underwritten character on this show.
You don't think it's a purposeful ambiguity?
I think that it's just the show just runs out of runway at some point.
Okay.
Maybe we need fewer characters.
Okay.
It's weird in making the show this long. They've made it a longer season, and I really do feel like maybe it should have been tightened up, to seven
Okay.
episodes, and maybe HBO obviously wants more episodes of a popular show. That's just how it is. That makes sense. But I think that maybe it still didn't need the extra episode, or like I mentioned in an earlier episode, or it needs even more episodes. We could have a whole bottle episode where we see Mook in a side story to explain her. This show could easily have that type of thing where we flesh out a whole side character, and the season could be much longer. Or you could really streamline our focus to 5 or 6 main characters with another 5 or 6 secondary characters. Honestly, kind of like how season 1 was, which was a very, very small set of characters interacting with
Yes.
each other, right? But I think that maybe this is just a growing pains for what the show's trying to become. But yeah,
Maybe.
I think that some of this is by design, some of this is probably
Yeah.
not,
I'm
unfortunately.
struggling a little bit with it. I love the moral gray areas.
Yes.
It's my confusion over whether I'm properly understanding why characters are doing what they're doing that I'm struggling with.
Okay, a couple more things I wanted to talk about before we get into
Yep.
that breakdown, and we can actually touch on that theme again for sure, because I think it.
Oh, yeah. My confusion will be clear as we discuss this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think everything you're saying is very pronounced in this particular episode. First of all, Michelle Monaghan, in one of her interviews, said that everybody out there who thinks the monkeys did the murder, you guys are all wrong. So my original going in proposition that it's going to be a monkey murderer, which I had kind of thrown by the wayside, but if we
No,
want
no, but
confirmation of
wait,
that,
but wait.
yes,
I had raised before the possibility, and I think it's still a possibility. The monkeys did the shooting, but they didn't do the murder,
good. That is a very good point. Given
right?
that's a good point you make. The monkeys might have gotten their hands on someone's gun
Yeah,
or
trigger
picked it up.
happy. Yeah.
Yeah, picked it up off the ground and started. But that may not be the actual cause of death. Oh, and one thing I wanted to shout out also on Rewatch that I found kind of interesting. I had talked about how multiple scenes in last week's episode really built a lot of suspense, and I couldn't really put my finger on like why was it the music? Something was creating this tension. And I only realized this on Rewatch. Mike White is doing something very clever here in writing this show and using things we've seen in previous seasons, not only as possible Easter eggs, but also to build suspense. So when Guy Talk is roaming around the apartment looking for the gun, kind of mirroring things that have happened in
Mm.
other seasons to create misdirections and Easter eggs, but also maybe suspense in those interactions. So then subliminally, you're internalizing that, like, get out of that house, Guy Talk, get out of there. Because, we've internalized this from seeing the previous season.
Last time this happened, it ended
It
badly.
didn't end
Yes.
well. Exactly. So, yeah, I just thought that was clever and I think definitely intentional. And the last thing I want to bring up is, did you have anything to add? I'll put this in the show notes. There was an article about the
Mhm.
costume designer for the show, and I know you're very interested in the fashion of the show, talking about how there are Easter eggs in the way that people dress and what it says about their character, but also specifically the victim has already been revealed in the costuming, although they will not speak to what that is until after the finale, obviously. But points out, for example, that in season 2, Tanya's dress that she wore was seen on a mannequin in some death scene earlier. All that is to say that they are foreshadowing things in the costuming. But what did you get out from reading that article? I couldn't understand the context of, for example, this person wears this label, which says something about them, and this person wears that label.
Yeah.
I didn't really pick up on that, but did you pick up anything extra? Specifically among the 3 women, do you think, like, if you're familiar at all with the labels they wear, do you think that you know something about how Jacqueline dresses versus, I assume, even from just looking at it as a layperson, that Jacqueline's wardrobe is more high end, but the other ladies seem to be very put together as well, no?
Yeah, I think they are all very put together. I read the article a little while ago now, so I don't have a distinct recollection of the brands, but I do remember a reference to Jacqueline's Erewhon tote bag, which I know is considered this very super she grocery store in LA where everybody goes for their, $20 protein shakes or green juice or whatever it may be. So that to me very much aligned with her character. So I do think there are a lot of purposeful choices that do make I agree. All three of the ladies look very put together, and it seems like they've made an effort, though. I think, especially, if anything, I'm noticing the wardrobe more of Lori and Kate, because
Yeah.
I think Kate has a very put together stay-at-home mom,
Hmm. It's more
wealthy
conservative as
Texas
well. Yeah.
wife look. And I think Lori has a high quality wardrobe that reflects somehow that she's a very busy woman and can't put that much time into her appearance. I'm
It's
not
very
sure how they're
pragmatic,
doing
right?
it,
It's
but
quality
it's
but
coming
pragmatic.
across. Yeah. And then, like, the change this week with, you can see she took a little bit more effort with her
Hmm.
hair, it's blown out, which, to blow out curly hair straight in a humid environment is actually a lot of effort. So they kind of showed the contrast of, now she's trying to look put together and she cares a little bit more than she did before. So I
And
like
she
that.
likes it that that guy notices her hair.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so let's get into this episode, Killer Instincts. So right off the top, some shows you have to kind of work to understand what themes they're dealing with. Not so much in this episode. We open immediately, and this is kind of interspersed throughout the episode. A Muay Thai, Muay Thai. How do you pronounce that?
I think it's Muay Thai.
Muay Thai, a Muay Thai fight that we're actually going to see later that night. But it's the whole idea, the duality of these perspectives, of hearing this Buddhist monk saying that the Buddhist way is always the nonviolent way. Violence is something that taints the perpetrator as well as the victim, and that the only response to violence is to reflect on it and to not take action. So that's the Buddhist philosophy. But of course, also there's a very commonly understood Eastern concept of yin and yang. And yin and yang, for those who don't know, yin is associated with darkness, passivity, and femininity. So we go back to the idea of you're protecting yourself with your feminine side. That didn't necessarily mean a womanly side, but it meant this dark side of the yin and yang. Interesting that femininity and the dark side are correlated there, by the way, Sona. Something I can vouch for. Just kidding,
Mhm.
just kidding. But and then the yang side represents light and active and masculinity. So it's this idea of these two things. And once again, they're not that it's one versus the other. In this philosophy, one arises from the other. And of course, also you have the white dot inside the dark, and you have the black dot inside the white, which also represents that these two things actually exist within each other. And of course, the circular pattern actually means that one thing then leads into the other. So it's not that one thing is diametrically opposed to the other. The two things are part of each other. And by the way, these dueling philosophies are represented here in the dialogue as well. We have, of course, the monk specifically talking about the nonviolent, philosophy versus Mook, who is the speaker of the other philosophy.
Yeah.
When you see Guy talk, speaking of, I think I'm a Buddhist, I don't want to be violent. It's not that I was scared, I just don't understand the point of it, as opposed to Mook telling him, no, see, this is part of life, and repeatedly saying it, that you need to be more active, right? You need to be more masculine in this particular polarity. And then, of course, once again, when they actually are at the fight, she goes, see, this is part of life. And she says something which I think is very true, and it is something that people do have to wrestle with, which is the idea that yes, you can be peaceful, yes, you can be nonviolent, but you perhaps choose to live in the world as it is what she says. And that, of course, in the world as it is lived, there is violence. You have to acknowledge that this is part of the world as well. And I don't think that the show is trying to tell us this is correct and this is wrong. It is about characters, specifically in this episode, considering whether one approach is correct or the other. And I think they kind of lay it all out there very early in the episode.
It made me think of Indian religions, which are also, I'm using Indian religions as a shorthand for Hinduism and Jainism, are also founded in principles of nonviolence. I think a lot of Eastern religions are. If I remember back to my college days when I read the Bhagavad Gita, which is like, an ancient text in India, my very fuzzy recollection is that the book is about espousing nonviolence, but understanding when more morality and your convictions require you to take some sort of violent action,
Mhm.
which I think is an interesting concept in the framing of this show that you can aspire to live a nonviolent life, but there will still be certain situations where violence is necessary and unavoidable. And
And
I
Guy Talk may
also,
be on that trajectory, by the way.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I also thought about how it's very easy to simplify this idea of violence as a physical violence, but definitely, at least in Jainism, I can't speak to Hinduism, the idea of nonviolence, it is incorporated into every aspect of your life and how you think and how you act and how you speak. You can be violent with words just as easily as you can be violent with actions. And that made me think of the three ladies first, more than anything else.
Yes. Mhm.
Considering the intentions behind your actions and your words and whether they're going to cause some kind of pain to somebody else.
That's very much the yin and yang, I think, dynamic playing out between them, where this is a cycle that has gone. And of course, it was from that playful slipperiness of the three to aligning against one, oftentimes, but how that was like a functional interaction. And now this more aggressive and non-functional version of it, where they are splintering apart right here. But
Mm-hmm.
but this doesn't feel like this is they splinter apart and they'll never be together again. This feels like this is the cycle of their relationship, right? And a lot
It
of
feels
relationships
like
are
it's
like
been
that.
they've been there before. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And that is oftentimes how these relationships work over time. But I want to start off our breakdown here with Rick and Frank. Some of my favorite parts of this episode are in here. And we ended on that incredible, like rewatching the final moments, Walton Goggins' face. And it's kind of a letdown considering how incredible that last scene is with the music swelling. And you know that this is the thing he's been fantasizing all his life and he's about to have it. And we cut the black. And it was like, I got goose chills watching it even on the rewatch, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. So in a way, it's a little bit of a disappointment. It still has some of the best performances and some of the funniest stuff that happens in this episode all happens
I
here.
think one of the funniest episodes of White Lotus I've ever seen, honestly,
There's so
in
much
those
comedy
scenes.
in with this. Once again, the yin and yang. There is so much comedy mixed in with such really dark material.
Those first moments where they are meeting with Shritala are laugh out loud
Yes.
funny for me, really hysterical. And I mean, I loved everything about, Rick has not prepped his friend for this
Not
meeting
at all.
whatsoever, like not even given him the most basic details.
Yeah.
And the friend has gone along with it. Sure, I can do that. How hard can it be? And watching him trying to figure things out on the fly, the stress hitting him to the point that his sobriety goes out the window, which should not be funny, but it was.
Exactly.
I mean, all of it was just classic. He worked on The Notary, a three-part series. I mean, all of it hysterical.
Yeah, I love how he was coming up with random titles. All of this is so funny too because it's shocking how bad their prep was. Where you could imagine just if you're good at this, and I kind of suspected maybe these guys were con men, but now it sounds like maybe they were just hired muscle, and that's how they know each other because they do not seem to be have any kind of aptitude at
Not at
being
all.
con men because it's like you can just do an IMDb search and look for like some producer that doesn't have a face shot on there that hasn't made any really big movies and just memorize five or six of them and be like, that's what I made, right? And then be like, hey, what movies has she been in? Just do like a Google search.
So
Just find like,
easy.
oh, it's not that hard. And it really feels like Frank is there to back him up and that he's assuming that Rick has done his homework so that he turns to Rick and like, Rick,
I mean, she previously asked, oh, which movies of mine was he watching? I mean,
exactly.
this was like the bare minimum that you
Yes.
needed to do was a quick Google search. I liked what it told us about their characters, but I also just enjoyed seeing them in this awkward place.
Oh God, Frank is freaking out. Like you said, he's just like, I'll have a whiskey too.
Yes.
But this does it's very interesting that this is very funny, and simultaneously we know that he is murderously angry at Jim, played by Scott Glenn here from Silence of the Lambs. He's 86 years old now, and Sona, I don't know if you remember him, but we just saw him in Bad Monkey. He was Vince Vaughn, Yancey's father in that show.
I was trying to remember where I had seen him recently. Thank you.
Still working at 86, pretty impressive. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to see him again, even though it seems this could very well be, if this was a lesser actor, I would assume that we might not see him again. But considering he barely has much dialogue here in this particular episode, I'm pretty sure you hire someone like that to see him come back in the finale. And I am curious to see how they use him in the finale. I assume he's going to return to Resort, as is Rick. This scene between the two of them starts to get intense. He pulls out the gun. He's like, I've been thinking about this all my life. But then when push comes to shove, and here's perhaps how I always felt on the show, that even from the first episode, maybe it's going to be Rick that is on this enlightenment trajectory, that he's unable to do the violent thing. Not only not shoot him, he can't even punch him. He just knocks him over in his chair, which I guess for an 86-year-old is pretty debilitating enough.
It could be. He could break a hip.
He could, yeah. Could hit his head and knock himself out. I kind of knew pretty early on that this was not going to go in that particular direction, because, speaking of the comedy here, they are intercutting this very tense conversation he's having, which is escalating slowly, approaching the revelation of his mother and the story he knows of this guy, which he seems to be a little baffled by. So once again, we can talk about that as well. Then cutting to Shritala and Frank watching, Frank drunk now at this point, watching this video of hers when she was younger. Obviously not even trying to pretend that he's this person anymore, because he's like completely baffled, like, oh my God, that's you? This guy's supposedly a fan of hers. Right? So all of this is just hilarious, the way that
and the whole, it's like Peter Pan and Pippin, and I can't even remember what other references were in there, all wrapped up into one. Like,
it's like she's rapping and it's folk music at the same time. The funniest thing about it, of course, is that is a very funny thing to see this Thai performer rapping, but that's actually her in some footage from years ago. So it's very funny that that movie does exist somewhere out there. And the commentary on it, of course, about all these mixing of genres, which often is the case with Eastern movies. And then Rick bolts out of there and takes Frank with him, and tells the security guards, very lax security here, by the way. I guess two white guys, even if they're not producers and they're just trying to meet her, they don't raise too many flags. But hey, this guy got a gun in there, so that I'm not sure these security guards deserve a raise here. First of all, what do you think of Jim's reaction to hearing this revelation?
I guess what we are supposed to accept about Rick, this is me questioning how much I understand what's going on with these characters, is that he's fully bought into Jim is the man that killed his father. And it has not occurred to him that any other situation could possibly be the case. Because to me, Jim's reaction when he heard the mom's name, who's escaping me right now,
I don't remember either,
seemed to have possibly some recognition of who that person is. It didn't just seem like an incredulous repeating the name back. It seemed like, wait, her? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think anybody in a more calm state of mind would have said, yeah, her. Don't you remember her? What do you remember about her? Something, right? But he just, bulldozes right past that flicker of recognition to, fake him out that he's going to punch him and toss him over in his chair. So I was so curious to know more about that. And I felt like, just ask him a question, give him a moment to say something.
That's why I feel like, for the same reasons, that this seems so not only unfulfilled, but there's all those questions that get raised. Like, he does recognize her name. He's like, hold on a second, what? Which, by the way, goes all the way to my Darth Vader theory here, where Luke is like, you killed my father. And Darth Vader's like, Luke, spoiler alert, everybody, Luke, I am your father. So I think that is, I actually think that's the shoe that's going to be to drop. And I was looking for clues of that. And I do think that might be where we see that recognition of him going, hold on a second, like, I was with her. Who? What are you talking about? And
Right.
maybe this is a son he didn't know about. And when she said that this guy killed your father, maybe it was the fact that he made this land deal in Thailand and never came back. That's what ruined his relationship with his father.
Mm.
Of course, he never returned to be a father to him. And I do think something like that is going to play out next week, because either if they were going to give us those answers and we'd have them this week, or if the character was going to be an ambiguous character, he wouldn't have had any reaction to it. It just seems like there's another shoe to drop, basically. And I assume there's going to be some kind of reconciliation in the finale between the two of them. And it would make sense. I mean, they're all heading back from Bangkok back to the White Lotus. I mean, Jim was not the White Lotus, but his wife was. So if he returns with her in the hopes of running into him, because of course he knows he's staying there, then maybe he'll finally have that conversation that they didn't get to have this week. I do hope so, because I want to know.
Right. I'm so curious.
Do you think the gun's going to come back? He goes into Bangkok. He disposes of the gun. He's like, hey, you want this? Frank says, no, I don't need it. So he just throws it in a trash can. Do you think that's going to come back in some way? I can't be, right? This is in Bangkok. Who's going to have that? That gun's not going to tie into the finale, is it?
I don't feel like it would, or at least it hadn't occurred to me at the time that I watched it that it would.
It's just so weird that he like doesn't throw it in the water or something when they're in the boat. Like they leave it
Yeah.
in a place where potentially someone could retrieve it. All right, let's move on to talking about the Ratliffs. And let's start with the two characters that are the least defined, perhaps, on this show. One of them still underdeveloped for sure, but the other one, these are the siblings, Piper and Lachlan. But the other
I
one,
figured.
intriguingly, yeah, you figured, right? Intriguingly, perhaps revealing a different aspect of their personality. And weird that they are both at this retreat. He's not only on board with, I think this is a good idea, I want to do it too. And what do you think that does to her decision making? I have a theory, but I'm curious to get your feeling.
This is another example for me where I'm kind of wondering if I'm properly understanding the internal thinking of a character. So obviously, she doesn't have a good reaction
Right.
when he
Mm-hmm.
says, I think I'm going to stay too. It's unclear to me if it's because, well, you can't stay because this is supposed to be my thing. So it can't
Exactly.
be your thing also because I'm supposed to be the one that's different in this family, and
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm supposed to be the quirky one that does these types of retreats. And, it won't be so special if you do it too. Or if it's, I was having conflicting feelings about staying, and it's going to be a lot harder for me to bail out of this if you're saying that you want to do it too.
Mm-hmm.
Did you come down on one side or the other of that?
I read it mostly as this was supposed to be her thing. And then all of a sudden he's co opting it to some extent. And then does he just back out too? He becomes this very wishy washy people pleaser. You can reread everything that happened up until this point in him just going with the flow always. So, like when he acts like a broish jerk when his brother's around, but then he seems to be very empathetic to Piper when she's around. But then it's just he's always just kind of doing what everybody expects him to do, or his interpretation of that is, even when he gets pure.
Incest.
Exactly. Even that.
Let's finish Piper first, and
Yeah, yeah,
then
yeah.
I
Please
think
do.
there's less to say on
Yeah,
Piper.
sure.
Because I just want to throw out there last week when her mom says, okay, just stay one night,
Right. Mm-hmm.
I feel like she was a little taken aback by that suggestion. And I
Yep.
felt like she was grateful when Lachlan offered to stay with her.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So to me, if this is a place that you're willing to stay for a year,
Sure.
why would you even want your
Mm-hmm.
brother there with you for that day if this is supposed to be your thing
Yep.
and you don't want him infringing on it? She was welcoming to him staying the night. So that makes me think that she already was having second thoughts.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And now he's going to make it harder for her to back out. So I feel like I could see it equally both ways from Piper. From Lachlan, I get what you're saying about him being a people pleaser.
Yep.
I think there could be something to that. But I will say your one characterization of, oh, when he's with his brother, he's like a bro and blah, blah. I don't think that's true. I think Yeah, he doesn't push back on his brother, but we haven't seen him be a jerk to women the way his brother is. He found his own way by doing magic tricks to charm the ladies. I
Yes.
think he does have some sense of self, but I think it's so important to him to be loved by his siblings
Yeah.
that he does want their approval. And he is trying to find his way to get that approval. For example, incest.
That's one way to do it. First of all, on Piper, we have that final moment where she's seeing that pipe dripping and we hear it
Hmm.
as well. And I don't think it's just the pipe dripping, but once again, it's hard to know what's going on inside of her head. She obviously did want this thing to be her thing. And now her brother's co opting it to some extent. You make a really good point, which I totally agree with. When her mom tells her, like, you won't last one night, not a year, you won't last one night, that really shook her. She felt like her mom was seeing her in some way that I don't think she wanted to acknowledge about herself. And maybe she hears that dripping pipe and that is concerning her. Can I really do this for a year? And her mom, her voice is preying on her. But more what it made me think about is maybe she is very much like Victoria, by the way. And maybe just like Victoria has decided, it took her years, but she was just like, I don't want to be poor. I want to have everything
Hmm.
catered to me. And that's what I'm used to. And that's what I always wanted. And that's what like. I've accepted that about myself. Maybe part of Piper's issue is that she doesn't want to acknowledge that about herself, but maybe that's exactly who she is, you know?
I think that's an interesting idea. And I don't think this is what's happening here, but I
Mm-hmm.
do think sometimes our parents think they know us
Of course.
way better than they
Mm-hmm.
actually
Yes.
do. So they'll say, oh, you couldn't possibly do this, or you would never like this. But it just shows that they don't really understand who
Right.
we are.
Right.
So in a vacuum, I could see it going either way, but in this particular situation, I would lean more towards your interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Also, as a complete aside, the accommodations at this place are way nicer than I expected them to be
Right.
for these kids. I thought they
Exactly.
would be in a room full of, like 40 other people on a similar journey
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
on a cot. They each have their own room here. That's amazing.
Yeah. This is not that bad. Exactly. Oh, and one more thing on Lachlan, I wanted to mention. You're right that he doesn't have that bros before hoes type
Right.
attitude that his brother has. But when his brother makes some kind of inappropriate jokes and he like laughs along,
Hmm.
and then the sister's kind of offended by this, or when he has that conversation, oh, he was saying that you're still a virgin, and she got all offended by that conversation. Like, why are we even having this conversation? Why is he talking
I
about
have
my
the same
sex life?
question. Yeah.
And so there's like kind of like Lachlan is kind of guilelessly being one thing or the other, trying to define himself by the people around him. Even more interestingly, when you were touching on all these things, Lachlan, unlike Saxon and Piper, it's like we very much know what their parents' opinion are of Saxon and Piper. Lachlan is like a non-person. He's just
True.
another person in the room when the parents are
True.
around. Why is he such a non-entity in the family dynamic when they're all together? If he's not doing magic tricks, this guy's got nothing going on.
That's an interesting point, and I agree with it. What you're describing seems to be more like a middle child
Right.
issue,
Mm-hmm.
right? The third
Exactly.
child is usually the baby of the family that
Right.
everybody dotes on, but that doesn't seem to be happening here.
Yeah. It's just an interesting dynamic and maybe, again, underwritten, maybe not well thought out, but it does seem interesting that they almost take him for granted as opposed to Saxon, who always needs so much attention. And the dad is kind of grooming him, or he's groomed himself to be like his dad. So his dad kind of has to like bring him along for the ride. And Piper, of course, who's like at contentiousness. Maybe the mom seeing versions of herself as a younger person. Maybe the dad, by the way, seeing younger versions of himself in Saxon. And maybe that's where the correlation comes from. We oftentimes see the worst aspects of ourselves in our children. And that's the things that usually irritate us the most. So maybe
Hmm.
that's what's playing out there. But then Lachlan's just kind of like there and just do going with the flow, and everybody's just kind of like whatever. But like you said, very much feels like a middle child who is kind of the lost sibling when you have the older one who's been there the longest, obviously, and is kind of like a co-parent, and then you have the younger one who's always babied, and then you have the middle one who's kind of just in between all the time. Yeah, it seems exactly correct that like Lachlan is almost like the middle child there, but for some reason kind of the forgotten baby, which is a weird dynamic for sure. Usually you don't have that. Speaking of the parents, let's talk about Victoria and Tim since we're talking about the Ratliffs. Oh, one thing I forgot to bring up, that Victoria has been off of her lorazepam. And
Yeah.
someone brought up the fact that the longer she's off the lorazepam, her personality is very much changing. She's becoming much more forceful. And I'm like, yes, she really is becoming the leader of the family. And you
Mm.
kind of see how her opinions in the background are shape the decisions of the family to a large extent.
Mm.
The less blunted her mental acuity is by the lorazepam, the more she comes to the fore in the family. Especially as Tim is like now completely, zonked out at all 24/7. And Tim and Victoria, Tim's still pounding the lorazepam, of course, are get invited to this party. Not the boat people.
I loved that. The way she said that, the line delivery was perfect. Also, is this a bottomless bottle of lorazepam? Did
How
she bring a
much?
90-day supply with her? It doesn't end.
Apparently she said that she just renewed the prescription and she brought the entire bottle. And that's
Oh,
when
good catch.
Piper
Okay.
made fun of her, being like, why do you need that?
You're right. Good
But
point.
maybe the mom thought like, I don't know what this is going to be like. I might need to be zonked out for the entire 7 days. Little did she know. I was surprised to see this, and I don't know how it's going to play out in the final episode, but I think they're trying to tell us something here visually. We see again Tim and Greg sitting next to each other. Greg still drinking his whiskey and just kind of observing everything like the king in his throne, and Tim all zonked out sitting next to him. And this is like the second or third time that they've, on the yacht. The first time, another night scene where they were sitting together, and of course on the yacht, and now here again. Where do you think Greg recognizes something in Tim, that he's another guy who's like circling the drain here? What are the parallels they're trying to draw between the two of these characters? Because in this episode, when they sat next to each other again, I'm like, oh, there's going to be some kind of revelation here, or Greg's going to like put his finger on his pulse and like know exactly what's going on with him. And he just kind of sits there and then he walks away, and I'm like, why do they have this kind of acknowledgement between them?
My only theory would be that Greg can see in Tim he somehow is in a really bad situation and needs to
Mm-hmm.
find a solution for it. Going back to that reference about people come to Thailand because they're trying to get
Right.
away from something or
Hide or seek, basically. Yeah.
right. Maybe Greg recognizes that desperation in
Right.
Tim,
Mm-hmm.
who, by the way, I think both times that Greg has hosted him has entered and said, "Where's the bar?"
Yes, exactly. And then they go and drink together. Yeah, there seems to be something in their paralleling these characters who are off to the side watching everything that's happening. Of course, Greg is kind of the master of his domain in both of these instances, even when they're on his yacht, of course. But then he's looking at Tim, who supposedly is the master of his domain. And he, I guess, can see in him that he is about to hit rock bottom. I assume that's what's happening there. Maybe Tim just finds it uncomfortable and walks away because it's kind of what ends up happening. Maybe he does have a feel that Greg understands him. But it does make me think about Greg in season one, right? Who really was near rock bottom when he meets Tanya. And then, of course, when he survives his cancer diagnosis, he becomes a monster, which maybe he always was. A couple of other funny things here. I mentioned this previously, but I loved Victoria talking to one of these girls and saying, like, you got to come back to us, North Carolina. I can introduce you to some nice guys. Don't be with that old guy. And she's like, I love him. And Victoria's like, are you safe?
Yeah, I love it. She's about to develop some kind of underground railroad for
Smuggle these girls out.
Thailand who could do better in her mind.
Exactly.
You had mentioned in the boat party scene that maybe we are looking at Rick and Chelsea's future
Yeah.
with
Mhm.
some of these relationships.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of your comment, made me think, well, maybe we're looking at their present.
Right.
Like, if she really is sincere about loving this guy, maybe it's just a different version of Rick and Chelsea.
When we first heard about Chloe and Greg, I thought that was purely a relationship of convenience. This revelation that Chloe really does care about Greg. Part of it is she says, I like the lifestyle and everything else, but she does seem to want to please him in some way. And I think it's not only, or at least at some point, it wasn't only the creature comforts. I think she was, committed. She was trying for this relationship. So it is interesting that there seems to be a whole culture of this. Now we're seeing at least three examples of this. And theoretically, there could be even more of these women in this circumstance that we're seeing on that boat and at the party, who have all gotten into these relationships with these older men. They require the financial benefits, but then maybe there is something more sincere there as well. So it is an interesting kind of matchmaking. Maybe that matchmaking, company in Dubai or whatever it was who matched them up are looking for, women who have daddy issues,
Yeah.
looking for older guys to take care of them. Speaking of daddy issues, we have Saxon talking to his dad here. Saxon now takes his dad aside. His dad has slurred his words and mixed up people's names before. So he knows something's off with his dad for sure. And of course, he was getting, before they all turned in their phones, he was getting all those notifications from people at work. And he's like, Dad, I need to tell you something. I've like hitched my wagon to you. I have nothing else going on. I'm just trying to be like junior version of you, which once again, talking about how parents see themselves in their children, this is very much how Tim represents how he grew up, where his dad was this huge success and he had this pressure on him that he needed to live up to that. So maybe now Saxon is the next version of him in the same circumstance. He tells him, Dad, you have to tell me right now, is anything going on? And his decision to be like, everything's fine. At that moment when he said that, I'm like, this guy has decided to kill his family.
I'm floored by what for me is such a huge redemption of the Saxon character.
Yes.
I would never have expected to like him as much as I liked him last night, based on, those first few episodes. And it feels somewhat natural. It doesn't feel forced in a way that like, oh, this is the arc you were supposed to go on if we were going to write this caricature of a fraternity brother gone wild in finance. And it turns out he actually is a sensitive guy. It doesn't feel forced in the way I think it could have. So I'm enjoying that. I like that he knows his dad well enough to know that something is wrong and that he is trying sincerely to figure out what is happening and how bad it is. I really enjoyed a lot about his character in this episode. I also, we didn't get to it yet, but I loved him in the conversation with Chloe and Chelsea as well.
Yeah. Based on last week's episode and this week's episode, if I had to bet on who is the character, and very much intentional here to make him the most despisable character early on in the show, if there's a character I had to guess is going to reach enlightenment, or at least go on a journey of enlightenment by the end of the episode, I think it's going to be by the end of the season. It's going to be Saxon, and I never thought that would be the case. I thought he was going to be a caricature throughout, and I actually think that maybe it's not Piper and Lachlan that end up. I don't know if he's going to end up at that monastery, but the character who actually has a new perspective on their lives by the end of this, he is going on this very unconventional journey. We might see Rick have some kind of redemption. And I never thought I'd say this. I think Saxon might be another one of those people who walks away from this, especially if he discovers that he's lost everything, that maybe those things can't, it's not that they don't matter, they can't matter anymore. So maybe he needs a new direction, and he's starting that journey now.
And something I really liked about how they've developed this character is his self-awareness that he is so tied to his father's success. Whereas I think a lot of people that I've met in similar situations, I'm going to fracture the saying, but it's something like born on third base and think you hit a triple.
Yeah.
Like they really believe that they did some hard work to get where they are. And it's based on some sort of natural brilliance that they have, that they've been so successful, when really your family and generational wealth can make a lot of inroads for you.
Of course. Yep.
His awareness of that surprised me.
It's surprising that he has that awareness because, like you said, most people do not. The simple fact is, when you actually look at 2, 3, 4 generations removed, if you were born in the top 25% of wealth, that 3 generations later, something like 3/4 or 80%, I forget the exact statistic, of your third generation of family is still living in that percentile. And if you were born at the bottom, something like a third to 40% of the people who were born at the bottom are still at the bottom. And then even the ones who escape absolute poverty, they didn't like become billionaires like some of these
Mm.
stories we like to hear. They're now like solidly middle working
Right.
class. Like that's as far as they made it in 2 or 3 generations. It's not only is it very hard to exceed that bracket significantly, it's very hard to drop significantly beyond that bracket at the higher end as well. But nobody's actually aware of this. You're just born into it. You're not aware that you're in, warmer water. You need to have some degree of awareness to step outside of yourself. And to think that Saxon can do that is definitely surprising. I don't think this is a revelation that he's making today. I think this is something that he's understood about himself for a long time. And it's just coming to the fore under this surprising circumstance. And part of it, by the way, is being surrounded by all these affluent people because he probably grew up where he got everything he wanted because he was like the rich kid in school and he was the rich kid in college. And all the kids who were in his frat, all their dads were pretty well off, but his dad was really rich. And all of a sudden he's surrounded by like billionaires and they're all like, whatever. Like if that's how you judge yourself, there's always someone who's richer. There's always someone who's more successful. There's always someone who's better looking. So if you judge yourself by this very strict criteria, you're going to always be behind somebody. And that's part of the theme here, I think, of that, being on the hedonic treadmill in the first place. And that whole idea of like Buddhism teaching you to let go of those material things. So definitely something that he maybe is approaching here.
As far as making this character arc believable, I give credit to the actor as
Oh,
well.
yes.
I think
Mm-hmm.
he's
Yep.
doing a really
Yep.
great job of making it believable when it didn't have to be.
I agree.
And last thing I'll say about this, I love the Chelsea character. I don't think she needs to be as mean to him as she has
Yeah,
been
she's
for
been pretty
most of
mean.
this series.
She does
I
help him
don't
meditate for a minute.
well, I think there might have been more going on there. I don't think it's aligned with what we've seen with her.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's like she's going out of her way to be mean in a way that doesn't seem consistent with everything else about her.
She seems to have a lot of patience, even with someone like Chloe. She makes a lot of excuses for Chloe's decision making, where she's giving Saxon absolutely no quarter at all.
To come back to our initial conversation here, these words are choosing violence.
Yes, exactly. She is reading him the way that we read him at the beginning of the season, and she has not softened her thoughts about him as we have. So I do think that's what we're basically seeing there. He is pretty much the type of person that she can't stand. And I think we all have that. There's certain people that they're just not your type of person. You're usually not
Sure, but
mean.
do you
No,
say it to
you
them
don't
in
say it
this
to their
way?
faces. Exactly. You don't say it to their faces. But yeah, that's the difference.
You go home and talk about it to your significant other like
You
normal
talk
people.
behind their backs. That's what the three ladies need to learn. Let's talk about the three ladies, by the way. This was a really interesting dynamic here. I loved the interplay between the three of them, specifically in this episode. All of this boiling over, all of this stuff,
Oh
talking
my
behind each other's
gosh.
back. You see the dynamic curdling, basically. It's not working anymore.
I was like holding my breath during their dinner because it just all came spilling out. I loved it. All of the stuff that's been going on behind everybody's back. Lori just cut to the chase and said it, once she got pushed too far by the other two. I do think, as far as somebody being in the right here, it is Lori.
Mm-hmm.
Jacqueline's attempt to spin this as somehow resulting from Lori's poor life decisions
Mm-hmm.
was so
Yeah.
strange. And then Kate piling onto that was
Mm-hmm.
weird.
Yep.
And then that unexpected revelation about how Jacqueline was hitting on Kate's husband. It
Yep.
just, all of it was such a fun ride as a spectator to watch, like just the palpable tension and awkwardness
Mm-hmm.
and resentment, and all of it was really well written, I thought.
Yeah, I thought this was all terrific, and it really pays off in a way that the ladies were a little cliche in the way they were written, and it reminds me a little bit of how Saxon was written in a kind of cliched way earlier on as
Mm-hmm.
well. And maybe the point was to, have this late in the season, making us reappraise our relationship with the characters. And that was the question I was directly going to ask you. And I think that the characters are written in a way where they all get to say truths, but of course
Yeah.
they're saying them in hurtful ways. But me personally had like no sympathy at all for Jacqueline in this particular case.
Agree.
Not only because, maybe this is a pattern with her and maybe she's always attention seeking, she is very ugly in the way she treats Lori. And then Kate is like, hey, I was taking your side in that argument. And she's like, whatever. When, for all we know, like if this is all true, she's hit on her husband before because of like this ingrained
Right.
insecurity that she has. This is one of these people who gets everything and then still complains about it.
I agree. And she also is still not being completely straightforward about what happened. She's kind of still trying to lie
Yeah, she's
about,
kind of saying, so what? So what?
yeah,
Right. But she's still not admitting that it happened, which is like,
right. She's not outright saying, yeah, it did happen. So there's that, right? The awkwardness of your friends knowing that you're lying to them, or at least not being straightforward.
by the end of the episode, it's only her and Kate. Kate saw, like she
Yeah.
knows. You can't lie to her about it. I mean, we shouldn't try to anyway.
And then trying to spin it as
Mm-hmm.
somehow, well, Lori, you had your chance, so how can you blame me if
Right.
something happened, but it didn't happen anyway? What I did like, though, is that I think it showed Kate to be a really loyal friend to
Mm-hmm.
Lori
Yes.
in the end, that, she's up late and texting her and worried that she's not responding to the text. Regardless of her politics and how they land with her friends, she is a loyal friend and she does love them and care about them.
I totally agree with that. And she's the one who's very concerned at the end of the night, but pretty harsh in telling her there's a pattern in your
Yeah,
behavior, that you're
agreed.
always unhappy, which, by the way, here's the thing. I also know people like this. They're in one relationship and they don't like being in that relationship because of this reason. And then they're in a completely different relationship, but they don't like it for this reason. And then they have this job and they don't like it for this reason. And there's always a reason for why everything's so terrible, right? It's very true to life, but it's pretty cruel to just throw her under the bus when, by the way, she's not the one who's in the wrong here. Jacqueline's the one who's trying to gaslight them.
I totally agree. We don't know the history of their
Right. Mm-hmm.
friendship and all of the different choices they could have used as examples, but the two specific things they used as examples seemed like not the strongest. I mean,
Right.
many people get divorced, many people are in unhappy relationships, many people don't make partner at a law firm. More
Right.
people don't make partner than do.
If you have a divorce, regardless of what led to it, even if you all thought he was the bad choice early on, if you go through a divorce, you're going to be unhappy about things. If you
Yes,
were looking forward to getting a promotion, and not everybody gets the promotions, but like, yeah, these are things that
right.
anybody, whether they were overt
Objectively.
about it or not, would be upset about these things happening, of course, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize that as continually choosing the short straw the
Right.
way Kate did.
If you want to get a divorce and then you get divorced, you're probably going to be pretty upset about it afterwards, just to say.
Yeah.
They were a little unfair to her for sure. I think it's in the dynamic as that type of lawyer personality has always been the one who's like, I'm the truth teller and this is what you're about. This is what you're about. And maybe that's her responding defensively to protect Jacqueline. And then, of course, Jacqueline rewards her by being like, huh, yeah, thanks a lot. I'm like, what?
Mhm.
What? And of course, Lori attacked her too, telling her that she
Yes.
pretends to just that everything's great all the time. So yes, everybody got,
Everyone got their barbs in. Yeah.
it's the whole idea of, like going back to the opening scene, the violence taints or stains the victim, but also the perpetrator, right? So this
Hmm.
kind of illustrating that here. And at this point, of course, Lori does leave and goes out to the Muay Thai fight. Also headed to the Muay Thai fight, of course, are Guy Tak and Mook. So what do you think about this date? It kind of goes badly here. I had mentioned to you that there is this thing about Mook where I was,
Hmm.
painting her almost like as a femme fatale, and that I was trying to read her in a more generous way. But I think now you're at a point where you see the darker side of her potential motivations, where I'm kind of flipping the script here a little bit. I think she is trying to, in my generous interpretation of this, and I could be wrong, she actually wants to have this relationship with him, but maybe needs him to be more forceful, more traditionally masculine, let's say, because that's kind of what's being hinted at here in the show. But basically, less of a Buddhist, and take the violent path. And when I say violent, I don't mean like she actually explicitly wants him to shoot somebody, but that she wants him to be more aggressive about the relationship, about his job prospects, and maybe he's realizing that it's not going to work out between the two of them. But I feel like maybe she is inadvertently goading him into making a really bad decision.
I mostly agree with what you're saying. I think she's maybe a shade or two more calculated than you're describing her
Mm-hmm.
right now. But I mostly agree with it. I think she sees the merits of having a relationship with him, but is trying to find a way to make it into the relationship she wants. Like so
Right.
many women
Right.
think, I
Mm-hmm.
can change him.
Right. Exactly. Right.
And I think she's not fully hearing what he's saying
Mm-hmm.
about the type of person he is and the type of person he aspires to be and what that means for what his choices are.
Right.
Purposefully not hearing it because she doesn't want to and she doesn't agree with it. And I will say also related, what a sweet face Guy Talk has, doesn't he?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like it's very hard to imagine him
Right.
being mean or violent with anybody. He just has like almost a little boy face on a grown man body.
Casting is so important. Half the performance is in the casting. So I really much do think that when you're looking at the person and these personas that these performers have, even performers we don't know, that there's a certain expectation you have of them and then the transformation of that. And sometimes, for example, with the Saxon character, even the way he dresses, this obvious, like overgrown frat boy, and then discovering depths within him. I think this is maybe the opposite, where even as he's a security guard and he aspires supposedly to be, I have a killer instinct, like you mocked him for saying that in last week's episode. Like, I don't know if he really has that killer instinct.
Mm-hmm.
It is the gentle version of this person who is maybe trying to force himself to be something that he's not. And also where I think that Mook is definitely not the femme fatale that maybe I thought she was earlier on, and manipulating him in some ways, being maybe a little nefarious. I think when he basically says to her, I really don't know if I'm that type of person, her disappointment doesn't feel like it is a way to manipulate him. It really felt like she, like you said before, she maybe had an expectation of how this relationship would develop, and it's not what she expected. So it is like a sincere disappointment, rather than being something a little more calculated. But she does try to, even when they go to the fight that night, she does say, see, look, it's a part of life. But very importantly, of course, Lori is there. She has met up with this Valentine 2.0. Don't even know this guy's name. A spitting image of Valentine. He notices her hair is done and
Mm-hmm.
they are flirting all night long. But most important of all, the tall Russian friend shows up. And when Gaitak sees that guy, it all like clicks in his mind. Oh my God, I was set up. These guys are the jewel thieves. And Valentine was involved with all of this. And of course, we have confirmation of that later when Lori goes on her little Russian adventure, hooks up with this Russian guy,
Mm-hmm.
and finds, as she's escaping, trying to get dressed and fly out the window at the same time, discovers the booty that they stole, the loot that they stole. She does seem to be enjoying herself until he starts asking her for money, a lot of money.
Speaking of the booty, great physical comedy
Yes.
here as
Mm-hmm.
she's trying to pull on those pants and jump
Yes.
out the window at the same
Mm-hmm.
time,
Yes.
essentially.
Yes.
I love this. I
Carrie
thought,
Coon, a great physical comedian. Who knew? But
yeah,
that's true.
really great. Oh my gosh, how painful to watch as she's in this afterglow.
Yeah.
He's trying to seize the moment to
And
ask
she
her for
realizes, oh man,
$10. Oh,
oh God.
and very insistent about it, not
Yes.
really taking no for an answer and giving all his, you can Cash App, you can Zelle, you can PayPal. I really felt for her in that moment because she was probably in the aftermath of everything that happened with Jacqueline, kind of like riding this high, and
Right.
he just brought her right back down to earth with a big crash.
It's terrible, exactly, because she's like thinking, oh, there's this young guy. He's so into me. My version of the same fantasy that Jacqueline just had, uninhibited and having fun, really enjoying herself, of course. And good for her. And then it's just like, oh my God, this was all like a ploy for cash.
Hmm.
Can you Zelly me $10,000? $10,000, man. He must have been really good if he's thinking it's worth $10,000.
Yikes.
I don't think anything is worth $10,000 in that regard. By the way, it does start to, like you mentioned, he gets very insistent. He starts to be like, you have to have that kind of money. You're staying at this resort, whatever. And it starts to get maybe this is the show does this a few times this episode, where it starts to hint that there might be something darker that could happen here. And of course, all of this is broken up by his girlfriend showing up,
Hmm.
going straight to violence, and her trying to dive out the window, which all is hilarious, of course. And she has to get a cab back home, the walk of shame. All right, so let's talk about Chelsea and Chloe and Saxon. We already talked about Saxon earlier. We were talking to his dad, but this scene between the three of them, first of all, this conversation is hilarious, but maybe there's something more going on here as well. Chloe goes, actually, I talked to Greg, and he has this fantasy. He always had this shame when he was young. He caught his parents in bed together. He just sat there and watched, and he wants to do that, but he wants to interrupt it in the middle. And as if Saxon hasn't had enough blows to his ego over the course of this show, for him to be like, not to be like, wow, I really want to get with you, but like that you are a prop in our sex fantasy. And then, by the way, like, and then you just leave. Like, when once he takes over, you can just go home. He's just like, no, I'm not doing that.
Do you think this is a real thing that happened, this conversation between the two of them? Because again, this is where I have a hard time
Yeah.
understanding what's real and what's not in people's motivations. Do you think this is a real conversation that happened?
I think that this conversation did happen because it's required for Chloe to have this conversation with Saxon. I think Greg has some ulterior motive.
Okay, you think Greg made it up?
Yes,
Okay,
yes. I
that's
don't
fair.
think Chloe, in her performance, she has not shown herself to be somebody who is making up outlandish stories. She seems to be like saying, as silly as some of the things she says are, she seems to just be saying them, right? So it doesn't seem like she would invent this thing. To what purpose? It didn't make sense.
Okay.
She seems disappointed in the end, where he's like, "All right, I'm going," and she's like, "Really?" I don't think it. So it seems like she wanted him to stay, or even thought that this pitch would work. But I do think that if, and I guess you can tell me whether you think this conversation happened at all. If this conversation happened with Greg, I don't think Greg is being on the up and up with her at all.
I think that is definitely a fair read on it. First of all, Chelsea apparently has perfected, as has Rick, the art of seeming unfazed when people tell you
Yes.
absolutely bananas things,
Right.
because this is the second time now that we just see her nodding along to something completely unhinged and acting almost like she's heard it before. Sure. But like a little boy's fantasy. She says something right at the end
Right.
that,
Of course.
oh,
Everybody.
yes, makes perfect sense. So I was very entertained by that. And I have to say, at the end of it all, I almost, for a moment, thought, is Saxon going to go along with this?
Right.
There was a beat where it seemed like maybe he was considering it. So I was relieved that he acknowledged how unhinged it was and just ended it by saying, I gotta go.
Right. Right. Yeah. I did wonder if he was so desperate for the attention that he would go along with it.
Right.
But no, he does not. Yeah, but there's a second there where he kind of like he just kind of shakes his head, and you're like, is he going to be like, okay?
Yes.
But he was like, no, this is a bridge too far.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, not for nothing, but even if you thought the idea of this was kind of exciting in some way, I'm not going to be alone in some weirdo's house with him outside the door. I don't know what's going to happen then. He could come up behind me and hit me with a club or something. Like, no way. I'm not on board with this, even if I did think it was a sexy idea. When they walk away and Chloe's like kind of like frowning to herself, like, oh, well, like that was just going to be a good night for her. She didn't think anything odd about it at all. I'm like, I do wonder what kind of experiences she's had in the past. Oh, and one last thing I just thought of is what is up with this season of the show and the whole incest thing? Because This, once again, she's
Yes.
even saying like every boy's fantasy to steal their mom away from their dad. That is probably true that there's some Oedipal
It's
complex that,
Freudian, yes.
yeah, of like
Mhm.
wanting your mom's attention, but explicitly like in this fantasy, it's like the having sex with the mother figure here, right? So it's like, what is up with this fixation
Yes.
on incest this season? I'm not sure yet if that is what they're trying to explore here, because it's or maybe I'm just uncomfortable with all of it, but regardless, there's a lot of dynamics here where it's two people talking. We have first Belinda and Zion talking. She is concerned with this invitation by Greg. Zion's like, go for it. It's not like he's not going to bother you. You might as well go. I'll be there. It's a public place. If you're going to confront him in some way, this is safer. Let's just do it. So they head over to Greg's palatial place. And of course, Greg, we see him. This is actually the scene where he's sitting next to Tim. And then when Belinda shows up, he keys in on her immediately. The person he's most curious to interact with
Wearing
here.
an amazing caftan, by the way.
Yes, another caftan. Yeah, exactly. Zion goes right for the food. He's actually preparing a plate when he gets interrupted by his mom. He's
I mean,
hungry.
he just flew in that
He just flew
morning,
in.
so
And he said he's hungry
understand.
too, right? Yeah. Why
Yes,
eat like whatever the hotel has, which is probably very, fancy food, by the way.
I
But
would
even
think.
though even those fancy places, they don't always have the best. It's not always like the place you would choose to eat when you're in a
Yeah.
resort area. So hey, why not go check out this fancy spot? And they'll probably have food there. So yeah, let's go check it out. Greg takes her aside. What do you think of this pitch? So we have this idea of course, thematically across this entire episode, the yin and the yang, the soft approach, the violent approach, the active approach. To your point earlier, that people are always kind of hard to understand what their motivations are because they're always telling half truths. And maybe that's the intention, that we are hearing truths and lies simultaneously. I do think that's what we're getting here with Greg. Greg is talking about how he wants to put this behind him. He just wants to live his life. He wants to stay in Thailand. I actually believe all that. And yet, of course, we know he's directly or indirectly murdered his wife here, right? His
Yeah, I
actions.
mean,
Go
that's
ahead.
the kind of the ultimate irony for me is
Right.
that he did try and murder her, but I mean, it is indirectly what killed her, but that's not how she died.
He set the dominoes in
Yes,
motion
he sure did.
that led to her death. Although, yes, it was not nothing that he planned led to her death. But yet she ended up dead.
Yeah,
But
lucky
she
for
wouldn't have.
him, she drowned.
She's just a putz and could have fallen into the ocean for any other number of reasons. But spoilers for season 2 if you haven't seen it. But the reason she was on that boat in that circumstance was, of course, because of an attempted murder. But at the same time, he seems like he is reaching out to her and, of course, also offers her $100,000 to get her business idea off the ground. Once again, another truth. I think, I did talk to Tanya about you. She felt bad about the way she left things with you. She wanted you to have some of this money. I actually believe all those things are probably true. And yet, of course, he is doing this as a way to see her reaction. Does he trust that A, she'll take the money, B, take it happily, and keep her mouth shut? And that's what he's trying to measure here, her response. And what do you think about her response here?
I do think it's nice, assuming it's true, that Tanya did
Yeah.
feel bad that she didn't follow through with Belinda, because I think that wasn't completely clear for us.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I think $100,000 is not nearly enough to be offering.
Agreed.
She's in this palatial home, given what she thinks happened and what he thinks she thinks happened. $100,000 doesn't seem like
Mm-hmm.
shut your mouth money level in this particular situation. Third, I was interested that she didn't reject it right away.
Right.
She does seem hesitant, but she also seems like she is maybe considering it,
Right.
which surprised me for the character that we know. But I also think it could have been, I need to get out of this house in one piece.
Mm-hmm.
So let me say I will consider it just so I can get out of here in one piece and then try and run out the clock or whatever. And then I thought it was an interesting thing that we saw her conversation with Zion later,
Sure.
about whether to actually take the money or not, which I think, regardless of what her gut is telling her to do, you would have that conversation of playing it out, the pros and cons. I liked all of this. I think it's realistic
Mm-hmm.
that Greg/Gary would try and buy Belinda off in this way. I think it's nice that he didn't immediately go to trying to murder her, possibly, right? Which was a
Right.
concern.
Yeah, I really like this because, like you mentioned, there's all that ambiguity in she, in a way, wants the money, obviously. She
Yeah,
wanted it from the very start.
right.
And there she has an opportunity to get some of it at least. She could ask for even more money. And maybe that's what Greg is trying to measure with her. Like, can I buy her off? If she asks for more money, then he starts thinking, okay, this is someone who'll work with me in some ways because she's morally compromised as well. But I think it's fascinating that in her character, she really can't do that. She wants to be a role model for her son. She says, this is some of this I'm getting is from that featurette after the fact where she's interpreting her interactions, that she wants to be a good role model for her son and always has been. So the idea of just being like, just take the money and run. Of course, there is that part of it. There's the pragmatic part of it. And there's also the fact that he is, money or not, he's still potentially a threat for her. So she is weighing that out, but she is almost incapable, from what we've seen of her, of hiding her true emotions. So her reaction that she's repelled by this is immediately apparent. And you see that Greg doesn't take it well. And I don't think it's just because she rejects the money, it's how she rejects it. And I think that he now knows that she's probably not going to be someone who's going to let this lie. And that is unfortunate for her potentially.
Yes, it is. You kind of got this feeling that he was controlling an impulse to lash out at her
Mm-hmm.
when she says, I'm going to sleep on it.
Mm-hmm. And Greg is showing himself to be a really creepy guy here because, unlike when you see the buffoonish Frank and Rick trying to be like CIA agents and like not even doing basic reconnaissance before they jump headfirst into their plan, Greg here is very manipulative. Kind of seemed like a hapless schmuck that fell into this situation with Tanya. Now he's looking more and more like a bad guy who maybe was just like for a moment when he thought he was going to die, turned out to be a slightly better person than he ended up being. He's very calculated in what he's saying to Belinda, how he's trying to manipulate her, the amount of money he's offering. He's watching her reactions to all of this, which heavily biases me in my reaction to when you asked before Saxon made the right choice to get the hell out of there. Greg is like not an honest broker at all. So whatever he said, don't trust any of it. Would you take the money, by the way?
I don't think 100,000 is enough, first of all. Oh, it's a tough question. I can definitely see the reasoning of, well, there's no amount of money that's going to bring her back.
Right.
Unless you are going to try and set into motion a police investigation in Italy, I'm not even sure how this would work. I don't think that I have enough facts to know whether to take this money or not. That's where I'm landing. How about you?
I have no ambiguity on this. I'm taking the money.
Yeah?
I'm taking the money. And then I'm going back home and I'm going to rat this guy out to protect myself, by the way. I don't want him coming after me. He wired me money. You can like find his accounts. This is part of the investigation. I'm doing it for the morally righteous reasons. Of course, I would take all the money out of that account before.
I think though you could be, the son makes a comment, or no, she makes a comment, I'll be an accessory. And he was like,
Right,
how?
right,
But
exactly.
I don't, I'm not sure the legality of taking that money. That's kind of what I'm saying. I don't have enough facts. I would need to do some research on various things before I make my decision. Okay, you would take the money. Would you spend the money? I think is the question that you need to answer.
Right. Would I have to leave it there? So, I'm like, I'm going to spend it. I'm going to spend it. I mean, like, sure, CIA or FBI, or whatever, try to come get me money from this murderer after I'm the one who gave you the lead to find him. Sure, whatever. I'll deal with that later. If that's even going to be the case. That's my general opinion of that. You enthusiastically take the money, make Greg feel like, don't worry, she bought this hook, line, and sinker, and then I can do whatever the hell I want after the fact. That's basically my opinion. Yeah. Would I morally take the money and shut my mouth? No, because I wouldn't trust this guy. I'm like, this guy could, he knows where I work. He's got money. He'll be like, oh, can you give me your home address? I just want to give her a special present. She was so helpful to me. And she blows up my house. I'm not going to deal with that crap. I'm turning him in.
all of this is true. But remember also, Belinda happens to be correct in what she thinks,
Yes.
but she doesn't really have much evidence. It's more her gut.
He makes himself way more incriminating by,
That's true.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true.
And then if you read it your way, then there's just another reason to take the money. If you rationalize that I'm just speculating here, I don't know about like basically what the head of staff tells her earlier that you're speculating and this is all random gossip mongering for all you know. You don't have any evidence of any of this. But yeah, now all of a sudden him taking her aside and asking these questions and trying to explain while he's in Thailand, he could be like, it's a coincidence. I like the way Lotus resorts. That's it,
Mm-hmm.
And, like he makes himself very suspicious here. But I think because he knows that she's not going to let it lie based on their interactions. To the broader point, maybe she can't pull off just smiling and saying, sure, which we've seen her do before. And she's not very convincing at that either. So all of that makes me worry because she doesn't have a very good poker face. Even if she was going to try to lie to his face, it probably wouldn't have been, she would have been pretty transparent about it. Speaking of, I forgot to bring this up. Speaking of a totally underused character and how maybe this show is a little misdesigned in being able to give depth to all these characters, we've shouted this out multiple times in previous coverage. The head of staff here, the German actor who's has pretty high profile after being in the Zone of Interest a couple of years back, the Academy Award nominated film. You bring in somebody who's kind of up and coming in this role that in this very short history of this series has been a pretty flashy role. You do nothing with him. As a matter of fact, in this very episode, he finally performs. And within seconds of him starting to sing, that the three blondes are talking over his performance. So it's like as if he's a non-person in this show, really.
Yeah.
And that's a character that seems like was cast and they just didn't know what to do with them once the show started shooting.
Yes.
And speaks to the fact of how you were talking about, like maybe some of the show is sketched in on purpose and some of it is maybe just, there's an example of where I think that's just a mistake that they cast the character, they needed somebody there, and then they're like, well, what are we really going to do with this character? So
I mean, at this point, we're in the penultimate episode, so.
Right. And what has he done so far? Right. If you acknowledge the fact that there is a head of staff and you cut him out of the entire show and you just said like, oh, I talked to him earlier today, it makes no difference to the show at all, unfortunately.
Right.
All right. And then we get to the very end of the episode. Saxon and Chelsea end up leaving at the same time. They walk back together. He meditates for like 2 minutes and he thinks, see, I'm growing. Let's have sex. But she doesn't fall for it. But you seem to think there was more going on here than I did.
Let's back up a little bit to that conversation between Chelsea and Saxon at the party.
Yeah.
This whole time I have thought, oh, this relationship between Chelsea and Rick has a sweetness to it, a tenderness to it. They have this connection. And I still think all of that is true.
Mm-hmm.
But hearing Chelsea's explanation of why she is connected to Rick made me feel like, Chelsea, this is an unhealthy dynamic. This is not going to work out for you.
I can fix him. That's the whole.
Yeah, I'm the hope and he's the whatever. And yes, he needs to be healed and I'm the person to heal him. Like, no, this is not what I like to hear from a woman in a relationship. I felt like Parker Posey. I can save you. You can get out of this.
Right.
I think that was some insight into the dynamic of their relationship that is interesting and for me, a little bit bleak. I always say there can be a relationship that is objectively dysfunctional, but if each person is getting what they need, it is functional for them. And that could be what's happening here. But objectively, I don't like that dynamic for her or for him.
Yeah.
What I felt happened after the party, and maybe I'm reading into it, I felt like when she sat to meditate with Saxon and held his hands for a second, she felt a little bit of emotion that made her uncomfortable.
And that's why she calls it off.
That's why she jumped up and started throwing books at him and saying, get out.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe it is the same lore, right? She specifically talked about the dynamic between her and Rick, and how when she met him, he felt like he was lost, but there was this soulfulness and something else. I forget what she describes it, but underneath, she said that he was, under the hardness, there was a softness. There was a vulnerability, and that's what attracted her to him. And maybe that's she's acknowledging that that is what's happening. She's seeing that in Saxon, for example. And I think that also speaks to the fact that you were asking her why she's so cruel to him. I think that she is judging him the same way. She sees him a particular way, and that is risky for her, because if she suddenly discovers that that is the same dynamic that he has, perhaps, that, her whole mythology that this is this chosen one to be with her, Rick, that might prove the lie in a way if she starts seeing the same thing in Saxon. But yeah, that's an interesting. I do find it funny that he thinks that 2 minutes of meditation has earned him enough points. It's like, that's not quite how that works.
Worth a try.
Right. Yeah. I was glad that she didn't hook up with him, though, I have to say. I want her to, not because like she shouldn't,
me too.
Not because she shouldn't hook up with anybody. I mean, and we don't know, or maybe that this is the next segue into the next point. Of course, we see that in Thailand, in Bangkok, Frank is completely off the wagon now. And he is, doing everything he's not supposed to do. He's like, I'll go back to the monastery tomorrow. But they're partying it up, drugging it up, whoring it up in Bangkok. And what did you think in those final moments of the episode where you see Rick is witnessing all of this? How do you read that expression on his face? I think that's the biggest mystery of the show in some ways, is this episode.
This brings me back to my original thought of the ambiguities with these characters, and that I don't feel like I clearly have a pulse on what people are thinking. I could see it as he's satisfied that he accomplished what he set out to do with meeting the man who killed his father in his head, and now he's unwinding and blowing off steam that has been building up. I could see it as he's about to go on this hedonistic binge of some sort. I don't know. How did you take it?
I thought about the bookend of that with the opening scene where the monk is sitting in front of everybody as they're trying to meditate. And he says that when confronted with these temptations and violence and the whole concept that you are running, all these weaknesses in your character are all ways of running away from pain. And that here he is sitting there. Oh, and of course, going back to that, by the way, that the monk says that the only response is to sit and bear witness and just meditate or just be there. So I feel like he is just being there in a very Buddhist way. And I think that he is achieving something that supposedly Frank has said that he's been pursuing. And he has it all literally in his face, but he is content, and he has turned away from the possible violence of killing, this retribution that he's been going after for years, decades. He's been pursuing this vengeance, and now, of course, presented with all of these other distractions. And he is actually not tempted by them because he has reached some kind of enlightenment. That's my reading, that Rick is on this redemption path throughout this season. That smile means that he is now in this circumstance where he would be luxuriating in all of this decadence, and he is content not to. And I think he's got some kind of peace.
I think it would be very nice if that is the case. So let's hope so.
Yes. And I could be completely wrong, and we could wake up tomorrow in a bed full of sex workers. And but I hope that's not the case. I really do feel like, given the structure of this episode, that is his arc. He's the monk at the end again. And of course, we'll know next week. That scene comes very close to the end, but of course, it's not the last shot of this episode. The last shot is Tim now fantasizing about killing himself, his wife, and his older son.
Yes.
All three of them. He finally goes to retrieve the gun. I mean, I was talking about how when he lies to his son, he seems committed to killing them. Well, here's the proof. And of course, the gun is not there. And it's funny that he does not even understand where the gun has gone to. I thought he'd remember Guy Talk. But also, by the way, I was like, I'm so surprised that Guy Talk walks back and Tim, locks eyes with him or something. In rewatching it, another thing that I rewatched last week, and they walk past each other. He doesn't even acknowledge him. This guy's so oblivious to
I
like
mean,
the
he's
workers,
zonked out of his mind on the lorazepam, first of all.
but neither does she. She doesn't make eye contact with him either. I think that one, he obviously is absolutely correct what you said. He's completely zonked out. And second of all, it's just another worker. I think these people are
Yep.
not even looking at the staff
Very
as they,
self-involved.
exactly.
Yes.
So they didn't even notice him walking by. So when he at this moment is like, where did it go? I don't think he has any
Putting two and two together.
he's not putting two and two together here exactly at all. And I don't think it matters to the plot at this point so late in the game. They're literally in their last day of the show. And somebody's last day, period.
Yes.
So, and that was the episode. What did you think of the episode in general? Did you be satisfied with this?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I am struggling a little bit with, as I keep saying, the lack of certainty I have about certain characters and their motivations and what they're really feeling. But I do think that's kind of a trademark thing of
Yeah.
White Lotus, somewhat. Not usually to this extent, but remember last year we talked about what's Daphne really up to? Did she
Right.
have a kid with her trainer? All
Did
of
they hook
that,
up when
right?
they went into the woods together? Like, there's a lot of things that are not
Yeah, which,
explained.
for whatever reason, at the time that I watched it, I thought not. In retrospect, I think they definitely did.
Right. I did too. Yeah.
And I was in the vast minority in thinking they didn't. I think I was so caught up in what had previously happened that episode, I wasn't thinking about Daphne and Ethan together. So I don't think it's unusual for this show to leave things undefined and uncertain. It's just that my personality is the type that I would like to know for sure. And, that's just something you have to kind of sit with when you watch this type of show. But if this last episode provides a little more clarity on some of these characters, I would really appreciate that.
I have a feeling to the design versus mistake of the show. I think we're going to get both next week. I think some things are going to get crystallized when you see the decisions people make at the end, or maybe even just overtly conversations people are going to have that are going to lay things out more clearly. But some of this is, I think, is just going to be unresolved, and maybe not by design, just because there's just not enough runway to fill in all these blanks. And some people just honestly weren't that well defined. I think I still can't get a really good handle on Piper, and I feel like I've never had any moment in the show there. I think the only time in this entire season where I feel that I'm in her interiority at all was the moment when she's in bed in this episode and the pipe is leaking, and she's just kind of sits in her bed, and she's thinking about Lachlan and what she's going to do next. And in that moment, I did project onto her this idea of like, does she really want this? Not only like, can I live in this circumstance? Is my mom right about me? But also like, do I want Lachlan here? Like, is this going to be an experience if he's here with me? So that's the one time I really felt like I was inhabiting her thoughts. I mean, maybe this is the only time in the whole entire show. And we're one episode away from the finale. So probably not enough to flesh her out.
Maybe they're treating her like a typical middle child, not enough attention.
maybe. She's trying to get that attention.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the scenes for next week. If you don't want to be spoiled for next week at all, you can skip this part of the conversation. Okay, the suicide tree, suicide fruit. Don't grow that on the resort, people.
Weird.
Kill that plant. Kill that tree.
Especially like I think kids are allowed at this resort. We haven't really seen any, but
yeah, that's a good point. We
some
don't know if
kids
it's
just like to
only.
chew on things.
Yeah, just pick it up off the ground, and if it tastes good. I mean, maybe it doesn't taste good. Maybe it tastes gross. But if it does taste good, then you don't know. Kids are gonna. That's a good point. The smoothie. We see the smoothie being blended, and all that racket about getting the smoothie blender. That's going to be the real murder weapon in this.
The murder weapon is the blender. Yes.
Yeah. Who? That's a big question we have now. Is not who shot the gun. Who will drink that smoothie? I bet you it's not going to be Saxon, even though he cannot turn down a smoothie.
We can bring this whole thing full circle to Jim Jones and
oh my God, the Kool-Aid conversation. That's right.
Yeah, it could be a family smoothie.
I do predict that someone will accidentally drink the smoothie. Not the target of the smoothie. Not one of the. It's not Saxon. Not Victoria. What else is going in there? The rest of the lorazepam is going in there. What else is going in there?
Probably poor Chelsea. First the snakes.
Oh yeah, I know, right?
Smoothie.
Now, Chelsea, who's going to get? No, she wouldn't get her hands on that. Who knows? Maybe someone's just hanging out in the apartment and goes, "Ooh, smoothie," and
I mean, she does know Saxon.
she does. Oh, I hope not. That would be. I would not want that. I don't like that.
Well, let's hope it's not Chelsea.
I hope it's Greg. Greg should drink that smoothie,
I don't know how Greg would get the smoothie.
unless someone knew to give it to him. The other thing we see in the next scenes, of course, is we see, and this is what heavily plays into my interpretation of this week's episode. We see Rick and Chelsea ecstatically reuniting on the beach.
Mhm.
They seem to be very happy to see each other and very sweet. So I do hope that these two crazy kids make it work. This 55-year-old
Fingers
kid.
crossed.
And of course, the other big thing is the whole fallout of Guy Talk's realization. He talks to his boss, and things are not going to go well there. So I did have a question mark as to why we see Lori see. I don't know if you have a theory for this. We see that she notices the jewelry that the Russian guy has stolen. So now she knows that he was involved in that heist.
Yeah.
But why would that matter to her unless she's going to go tell someone who works at the resort? But I mean, Guy Talk already was going to tell. So it seems like a redundant clue to put out there.
Maybe it was really for us to start tying everything together. I don't know.
It was pretty clear when he makes that realization. How many 6'4" Russian bald guys are walking around? It doesn't seem like he's very well hidden there.
You're right.
I think we suspected it the second that Valentine is there when the car runs by.
Yes, it's so true.
All right, so we'll all know. It's only one more week, so we will all know next week.
I'm excited.
All right. Thanks again for the conversation.
I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.